Hello, I'm Ron Marasco, and I am talking to you from the library in the parish house of St. Andrew's Parish in Kent, Connecticut, and wanted to chat today a little bit about C.S. Lewis. Well, where to begin or what to focus on with a life and a career and notoriety as immense as C.S. Lewis. So what I'm going to do is focus on one little aspect of his work that isn't often talked about, just the main points of his life. He was born in 1898. He died in 1963. He fought in World War I and is known as, of course, the author of two great Christian classics, the Screwtape Letters and Mere Christianity, and of course known to the rest of the world for writing the absolutely brilliant and delightful and epic Chronicles of Narnia, which many people view as, of course, a Christian allegory, but the whole entire world has embraced it, not the least of which is when it came out some years ago in a blockbuster movie form. One of the things that is also less known about Lewis is that Mere Christianity, which has been such an important book of conversion for so many people, was written first as a series of lectures for soldiers after World War II. So that's the period that we're going to kind of concern ourselves with. And I wanted to talk about a book that he writes at the end of this period because of something that happens just following the war. And the book is A Grief Observed. Now, a lot of people don't talk that much about grief, and this is something that C.S. Lewis himself understood. And so I think it's a subject that is important to talk about, and especially for us, for a few reasons. Not only the time that we're going through right now, where there's grief around people in many different ways, but also as members of the church, and in some cases, churches where there are older congregations, that grief is very present in a lot of people's lives and not always talked about. And it's not because people don't want to, it's just they don't always know how to. And I think one of C.S. Lewis's great contributions is that he really did find a way to talk about it in a way that was kind of warm and easy to handle. But he also talks about this reluctance people have, and he just says that it's often just simple awkwardness, that a lot of times people would love to reach out to somebody that they know is in grief, but just awkwardness prevents them. So let me just read you one little quote from his book, A Grief Observed, which we'll continue to talk about. I sometimes think that shame, mere awkward, senseless shame, does as much toward preventing good works and straightforward happiness as any of our vices do. That's the sort of thing I love about Lewis. He puts his finger on this thing, how just a little bit of petty shame can prevent us from reaching out in a way. So where does his understanding of grief begin? It begins before this with the writing, I think, of a book, another classic, in the same way that Mere Christianity was really a kind of philosophical classic of conversion. Another book that he wrote, which is a personal story of conversion, is called Surprised by Joy. And being a professor, both at Oxford and Cambridge, of literature and philosophy, he was somebody that often would think about a philosophical point for a long period of time. And he was on the subject of joy. And he wrote a book with a title based on a line from a Wordsworth poem called Surprised by Joy. And it was about that, how he made his Christian conversion, having to do with his understanding of the philosophical nature of joy, that joy is not just about the things that are here, but that it opens us up to something further, even beyond this world. And that's how he sort of found his way into Christian conversion. But as was true of so many things in his life, uncannily, a few years after writing a book called Surprised by Joy, he met a woman who was to become the love of his life, and her name was Joy Davidman. And she was a surprise because she was, first of all, an American, and although Lewis was born in Ireland, he lived in Oxford, lived a life of a very kind of bookish Oxford Don. He lived in a house with his brother, who was a war hero and rather hard drinking. So he was living the life of a bachelor and in his 50s. And he got to know through correspondence this American woman named Joy Davidman Gresham. And she was a force to be reckoned with. She had, I believe, gotten a master's degree from Columbia University in 1935. A master's degree at age 20. So that was unusual. And there were not a whole ton of women getting master's degrees from Columbia. So she was really something quite remarkable. And to boot, had two kids, two sons who were twins. And she formed this correspondence with Lewis, and then made a visit over Christmas, which was a very special Christmas. And if you want to know more about this, there is an absolutely beautiful movie that chronicles it. It's called Shadowlands. It's by Richard Attenborough, who, it's an unusual movie for someone like him, who often did epics like Gandhi and A Bridge Too Far. But this is such a beautiful movie, and it's the story of their relationship, C.S. Lewis and Joy's relationship, and their love, and then eventually her early death. It's Anthony Hopkins plays C.S. Lewis beautifully. Deborah Winger is just unforgettable as Joy. And they don't do the story of two sons. They only have one, but that's also played by a very excellent young actor. And a lot of times, let's face it, kids in movies can be a little annoying, but this actor is absolutely marvelous. I would so recommend it. It's very wrenching, but very, very, very beautiful. I certainly think if there's 100 movies that need to be saved to show what being a human being is, this is surely one that should be there. And it's brilliantly directed by Attenborough, who usually does these large epics, but this is really just sort of maybe an epic of small glances that captures so beautifully the nuance of love and loss. So I would really recommend this. In any case, Joy dies, and in the middle of her illness, which was a very terrible, very painful cancer, they actually do get married. And after she dies, Lewis is alone in this house, which had been so filled with Joy, who was not only very joyful, but she was also a powerhouse. I heard from somebody who actually knew Lewis that occasionally when people came on the property looking to hunt rabbits, at the house that they had outside of Oxford, Joy would occasionally chase them off the property using a rifle. So she was a marvelous character. And when she left his life, he was very empty. Now, being an academic, if any of you that are teachers know how much we love stationery and school supplies, and every time we get a chance to buy interesting notebooks, we have them around and they're half filled. And that's what he had. He was an Oxford professor, and he had a few of these little copybooks aside that were blank. And one night he just began to write in them, and he began to fill them. And he filled them with the story of what he says is the title of the book, Grief Observed, him observing his own grief. Now, it's very philosophical in a lot of ways. It is not sentimental. He does, in many ways, emotionally wears his heart on his sleeve, but it's the sleeve is tweed, let me put it that way. It's very, very philosophical, but there's something about his lack of sentimentality that actually makes it even more moving. And he spoke about things, especially his relationship to God, given what was happening and what had happened, in a way that was really, really so strong and so probing and so questioning of his relationship with God, that he ended up publishing this book under a different name. And still to this day, many copies have, the old book that I have has a copyright by N.W. Clerk, because that's how it was first published. And there were even some stories of people saying to C.S. Lewis, "Oh, you lost your wife. There's this book called The Grief Observed by N.W. Clerk. You should look it up." So that's kind of what Lewis was like. He was very self-effacing, but he really deeply understood grief. Let me just read to you a passage. And I think Lewis, being a professor, he had a real way of being able to explain very difficult things in very clear metaphors. And this is an example of the kind of writing that you'll find in A Grief Observed, where he talks about God taking this marvelous relationship away from him so soon. It was too perfect to last, so I am tempted to say of our marriage, but it can be meant in two ways. It may be grimly pessimistic, as if God no sooner saw two of his creatures happy than he stopped it. None of that here. As if he were like the hostess at the sherry party who separates two guests the moment they show signs of having gotten into a real conversation. But it could also mean that it had reached its proper perfection, that it had become what it had in it to be. Therefore, of course, it could not be prolonged. So that's just an example of some of this, I think, marvelous writing. It's as strange as this may seem, for certain people, this may be a wonderful Christmas gift to give. It's out in a very beautiful, new, small, not expensive edition. C.S. Lewis said, "I read to know that I am not alone." And I don't know of any other book that really captures the essence of that. Many people that are grieving do feel like they are alone. And C.S. Lewis is such a marvelous companion. He's very warm and he's very funny. I found a letter of his that I don't even think has been published, and it was just when he was dying. He died of kidney failure. He was writing to another friend of his who was also very sick and near death, and he was very amusing about that. And when at the very end, when he was really not even strong enough to write, he said, "I'm not strong enough to write a letter, but I'm just going to send this to you. Think of it as a wave." And I thought any man that would write that one-line letter and just view a letter at the end of his life to a pal as a wave was, I thought, very touching and very typical of the kind of person that C.S. Lewis is. He's a wonderful companion, and this book, A Grief Observed, is a wonderful friend to have to walk through grief, and I think it's a marvelous thing to share. And one thing about many of the things about him, we celebrate him in the church. Interestingly, he died on the very same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, so certainly he was not... it was a daunting time, so he probably did not get the honor he was due. But of course, as always in our lectionary, it's about giving people their particular due. And so I, of course, went on a little bit too long, but he's such a man for all seasons, you have to. And this is just from the parish of St. Andrews to C.S. Lewis, a wave. Thanks.